filmmakers should prioritize the creation of films to mainstream appeal, even if it comes at the expense of representing their own culture. To begin the debate,
Speaker, I think this debate must be looked at in the sense of a trade-off. And I think that given that Prime Minister here wanted to have her cake and eat it too, and that we can, we can reach out cultures and all that, she doesn't acknowledge that there is a natural trade-off in that you bastardize your culture to fit in with the view or the generalizations that the international community has of your own people. So where am I going to come in today's debate? I'm going to talk about two things. One, I'm going to talk about how individuals have a moral and ethical duty to preserve cultural purity, but especially so when it comes to local filmmakers. Second, I'll talk about art's function or film's function, perpetuating and innovating cultural values. So it's a little bit of like the discourse, but it's a lot more about the fact that when you take a particular culture's nuances and translate it to a different language or to the lingua franca, a lot is lost. And why that's actually quite damaging to the perpetuation of the local art scene, for example. Before that, let me just have some two rebuttals first. One is, and I think it's very telling, right? The reliance of the Prime Minister on Black Panther is a bit telling. The biggest problem with Black Panther, I mean, I love the movie, right? But the biggest problem that people have who are not as woke as we are is that people have a perception that okay, so first it's not African language, the language they spoke in Black Panther was Xhosa, right? Everyone would then have the perception that people in Africa generally spoke Xhosa, even though that's predominantly only spoken in South Africa. But secondly, like also the idea that everyone dresses like that, right? Like the big disc that you wear in the lower lip, like is that really quite widespread? No, it's very much a very specific thing. And so the problem with Black Panther as a whole is that it actually fit into a lot of people's like individual own stereotypes and generalizations about how people in Africa are. And by filling all those particular nuances, you've actually kind of reinforced some of the stereotypes of what people have about Africa as a whole. And I think that's particularly damaging when you talk about the role of film just affording the cultural value, or like this idea that your culture is more than simply the poor people in Africa. Secondly, this idea, and this is weird, right? And this is an inherent assumption that came from Prime Minister, this idea that we must reach millions. I don't necessarily see it as an intrinsic value in transmitting a culture as been watered down so much to be accepted by the international community that it's lost all meaning and nuance, that you can't derive meaning from it. And I think there's little value to that transmission as a whole. I mean, of course, people can relate to it, but they only relate it in the sense in which it's not different from us. And in fact, what you actually do, and this is segueing into framework, is this actually empowers the dominant cultures that exist in the world today. And that's actually how we should look at this debate, right? In the world that we live in today, there's a world in which you have many kinds of cultural hegemony. But of course, English is one of them. But I think the Hong Kong example is more to show how like Mandarin is used to kind of destroy any kind of dialect or very specific cultural nuances there. What happens today is a lot of languages and dialects are dying out. And there's a lot of heritage and history because of this driving need to try to appeal to as many people as possible to make as much money as possible. Therefore, the position of opening opposition, if you haven't figured it out already, is that local filmmakers prioritize films that represent their own culture at the expense of mainstream appeal. Let's move on to the first idea that we have, that individuals have a moral and ethical duty to preserve cultural purity, especially local filmmakers. We think that every individual does have that duty, if only because the harm to the broader human society is very grave, right? When you lose particular heritages or cultures through non-practice, you actually lose that. But more than that, it's like, so the same reason, to use an analogy, right? There's a reason why it's a crime for you to destroy archaeological finds, for you to find things that have been found and lost, things that have been dug up. Those things are crime. It's also a crime for you to take and steal those artifacts away from that culture and take it to your own home culture. And that's why there's such a huge controversy today in the Western world about the Elgin marbles and where they should return. So insofar as like So what we've shown here at the very least is that there's a moral obligation or ethical obligation, because if you lose these cultures, then they're forever lost. It's very hard for you to get back those things once they're lost. The same thing could also be applied, I guess, to endangered animals, right? Once they've gone extinct, there's no way for you to get them back. So once you've established that moral duty, then we would show first that, like, of course we have lingua franca, right? Like, enables us to communicate and function. The reason why we have art, and cultural art especially, is because it preserves a very kind of nuance that is specific to that culture, how they speak, how they dress, even how they tell their stories, right? And we think the trade-off here is that we acknowledge that maybe some cultures are less relatable to the international community. Maybe that narrows the kind of audiences we can reach, but we think that's an acceptable trade-off. Yeah, sure.
Your principle of cultural purity exists in a bubble, so I don't understand. Cultures evolve all the time, so why can't cultures evolve in these aspects?
I think, in a sense that the purity exists is that we should prioritize the particular nuances of that culture and the expression, especially in that culture, to that language. But if it comes to like having innovations like including English words, we should try to stack that out as much as possible. So I'm against the evolution of that very culture to appeal to the mainstream appeal, because it results in destruction of that very culture in the long run. So obviously then, what is the mitigation that we point out? One is that by focusing on this is that you remain as close to cultural roots and history as much as possible. That preserves the value of the educational value of your art and history. So if they're talking about reaching out to people, we think that's far more valuable if any foreigner who comes in and tries to learn about that culture actually learns it as it's practiced by the people in that very culture. But secondly, there's a huge incentive for niche and specialized fields in academia to prioritize learning about very specific cultures. Why filmmakers are important? Because the visual arts are very permanent. And if you look at YouTube today, it's very much even if you don't understand the language, right? You understand how they view the world simply by how they choose to frame their cinematography and how they used to position themselves, and even how they do their particular blocking. Without this duty, there's no imperative to fund and maintain museums, for example. Last argument, this arts function perpetuating, innovating cultural values. We think that the local filmmaker acts as a role model and acts as an avant-garde auteur, in the sense that they are the ones who are most commonly pushing the boundaries of what it means like for your values to be challenged, or for you to see how that culture deals with questions that they themselves cannot deal directly with, which is why the film culture in Iran is so vibrant, despite or in spite of censorship, because they've learned how to incorporate or tell their stories, even despite that thing. What you're reducing by doing this is you're reducing the ability of these own cultures to enable modes of dissent and discussion specific to that culture and trade that away for broader mainstream appeal. And you lose in the end a lot of nuances, cultural nuances that are specific and appeal to the minorities even within that very own culture. In the end, ladies and gentlemen, we're proud to oppose.
Thank you, Legal Board, for the speech. I can go on to Deputy Prime Minister. Thank you, Speaker, for the speech. Now let's go upon Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, it's really ironic that in a debate about nuance, opening government still refuses to acknowledge that there are nuances in the debate and there are trade-offs that you need to make, right? They seem to, and I think only towards like the second half, and I think it was a very flippant kind of remark by Deputy Prime Minister who said, yeah, Sanskrit, lost out, but we have these new cultures. Where it acknowledges that trade-off without really acknowledging why is it okay for us to lose all these vibrant cultures and at least make them blend a bit more into the dominant color or dominant culture that is, I guess, Western civilization when they talk about English, for example. Like, they needed to tell us why, though the particular loss of those cultures is particularly less useful than it is this idea of reaching out and understanding these cultures, right? I'm going to talk, so my speech is going to basically cover two basic questions, right? Is there like a duty to preserve like cultural purity here, or how do we really get there? Secondly, can we transmit cultural values without mainstream PR? And I think this is the essential clash. So the second question is really the essential clash of opening half, right? Because they want to talk about challenging stereotypes. They want to talk about reaching out to an audience, as many people as possible. They want to talk about creating this engagement. It's weird. It's also ironic then that they didn't engage with some of the arguments that Leader of Opposition had earlier, right? Which is this idea that one, I think he kind of skipped over whether or not there is an actual duty or not. Like, I think he just kind of waffles around. He doesn't engage whether or not there's an ethical duty towards forwarding, like, to appeal to many people as possible, to forward your particular culture. He doesn't actually resolve that clash in the end. I'll show you later why it still is in our favor. And I showed to you, especially then, that any trade-off that we have in terms of a narrow audience outreach is still valued by the fact that there are people, legitimate academicians, who will still reach out. Or not just academicians, there are many people out there who look for niche cultures to latch onto and to watch, and why those people will still win out, right? I think your culture is still preserved. I think what at the end of the day is he kind of waffles over this idea whether or not we need to preserve culture. Secondly, he also decides to ignore this idea that there's a loss of nuance in particular cultures that can only be expressed within a certain medium of film that doesn't translate very neatly into English or any other medium through which the international community, the international community can better exist. And why loss of nuance, I think, so that means they're acknowledging, they're happy with the loss of nuance. They're happy with the fact that people understand only things that they can readily understand without necessarily understanding that in order for you to be truly an international global citizen, you need to reach out from your dominant culture and reach out to the minority cultures that exist out there. No. Let's move on to this first idea. Is there a duty to preserve cultural purity? I think it's really been resolved like in our favor, right? I think we've showed you that there's an ethical duty in that the loss of these particular diversity and history. He says we should just read history books, which ignores the fact that art in and of itself is a performative act in which people every day practice that art. It's not just about the art, it's about the language that is being spoken in these films. The fact that language is lost. You cannot simply learn a language and the nuances and the slang from reading a book. That's why his response is very flippant and actually quite glib. We think that's quite ignorant as well. Secondly is this idea of, okay, so let's talk about this idea that he wants to deal with stereotypes. He says, oh, you're not changing stereotypes. One, we never said that was our objective. But two, at the very least, we paint a very realistic picture of whoever sees our culture, of what our culture really is like. Anyone who watches that film knows us for the nuances that we have, not according to some broad idea. And lastly, this idea of Black Panther is really problematic because we look at the main actors, they're all from the UK or from America, because that appeals to what people think African males should be like, and that's why they didn't have an actual African male actor be the protagonist of these films, right? So he's okay with Sanskrit losing out. But what we mean also is that the duty to preserve cultural beauty exists if only because, and this is where the nuance for opening government misses out, the fact that there's a dominant culture and there is a dominant culture that is seeking even indirectly to wipe out your own native culture, even indirectly through broad practices, means that there is a broader duty for minorities to protect their own culture from being slowly wiped out by the through misuse or lack of practicing that very, film or art culture. Sit down. Secondly, can we transmit cultural values without mainstream appeal? We would argue yes. One, we think that to engage with this idea about, should cultures evolve, right? We think that cultures, so acknowledging, right? Cultures do engage and deal with innovations in modern times. But we say that they should be on their own terms, which is why the French, for example, refuse to take in English loanwords. They would translate any particular English term into French, or the particular, it's very much more telling in German, to be precise, right? But what does that do? What it does is it creates, one, an incentive for people to learn that particular culture a bit more. So that means that if you don't understand French, why? Do you demand that all French films be in English? No. What you do is you watch subtitles, you learn French, you take French classes, and that's the kind of engagement they really want at the end. The kind of engagement they want is a legitimate kind of engagement where people are curious about your culture, they want to know the nuances of your culture, and we think that only exists if you maintain films or, films that are only produced in your local culture. Sure.
Look, you lose out on a lot of engagement when you want to ask people to learn French. But more importantly, I don't think Sanskrit non-stop. It's beautifully written within our Vedas and so on. But what you lose out was the nuances that came afterwards. The development of the culture, like yoga and other forms of Indian philosophy. So what would you do with that form of development?
Well, I think that in the end, any kind of innovation development should be on their own terms and should not be forced on or should not be allowed to impinge or be, we think that the local practitioners, especially local filmmakers, should not let outsiders determine or dictate the terms in which your culture very much exists. And that's really where it comes out. Look, we don't think the world will lose out in the end because it gains more from each culture developing on their own. And at the end of the day, what we bring to you in opening opposition is are various individual minority cultures in which the filmmakers preserve or practice that art. It gives a role model for other local, nascent, younger filmmakers to continue practicing that art. But it gives an incentive for outsiders. I think today there's a greater incentive for people or greater kind of urge for people to go out and recognize that your own culture is not the most important one. And what it does is it creates an incentive for them to understand that, look, if you want to understand other cultures, we shouldn't demand or we shouldn't expect that they know how to speak English, but that we should expect to know their local languages, and they should expect us to know their local languages. That's why people move to Paris. That's why people immerse themselves in their local dialect. I think the stubbornness of local filmmakers in refusing to give in to the appeal of the mainstream is what makes these cultures survive and make sure that other people from outside your country immerse in themselves. So even if the culture dies out in your own country, outsiders still have a broader, richer, and actual appreciation of your culture. We're proud to win in opening opposition.
Thank you so much. Steve, you should begin the closing half, right? Okay.
just said? Black Panther, Iron Man. For a moment, I thought you were going to crack something racial on me. Like, oh. Stop laughing at that. We think that the opening half merely discuss the ethics behind whether we should do or whether we should release or conform to the mainstream media. We don't think that they mainly discuss the implications that it has and the drawbacks that it has specifically on countries that are going through lots of problems, especially when they are being, or the stereotypes are being reinforced and being used against this. We think that's something that's extremely bad, and that's something that only side opposition combats, because we're the only ones that provide a need for individuals to open up books, open up history books, open up language, textbook, and actually understand and dissect what is going on in a particular culture and what is meaning to be portrayed. We think that in this case, we win this debate, right? But let's first pick off, before I go on, let's first pick off some of the things that opening half and closing half talked about, right? So firstly, we had Prime Minister who came up and told us that somehow audience require language barriers to be lifted in order for us to understand certain situations. My POI was very simple, right? Why can't things like slavery just be graphically shown to an extent where you kind of understand as to what is going on and what is bad or what is good about these particular traits, right? We tell you specifically that graphic images or things like this do not require languages to directly translate as to what is going on or exactly convey the message that something bad has happened and something bad will happen or has continued to happen. But the second thing is that if you're going to conform to mainstream media, you also have to understand that a lot of the content that has been explained is going to be extremely watered down. Why? Because if a lot of foreign investors come in, like your producers and all these things, choose not to add certain images or certain particular stereotypes, then you have to conform to those ideas and you have to water down all of your content anyway. So we don't think that the huge benefit comes of you understanding a culture just because some language has been changed and it's been watered down to an extent in which the true case of the story has not completely been explained. The trade-off here is very simple. That may have confused it, but the trade-off is simple. Whether you get quality information as to what has actually gone on in a particular country and what situations or stereotypes that have been formed by these particular events, or you have watered down events in which you look at Black Panther and you think that, oh wow, look at all these wonderful costumes these people are wearing. Is this how general public or populations in Wakanda or so-called South Africa are supposed to look like? We think that it's much better that we portray something of the truth, and we think that we stand for this. But DPM came up and told us this, that look, ladies and gentlemen, we will promote larger forms of understanding if we have larger forms of exposure. We think this is completely false, right? Because if you're exposing the same rhetorics that the mainstream media already has in order to garner your supporters, in order to make the amount of money you want, then you're going to only be repeating the same ideas that exist in current society. That means that your stereotypes are still going to continue. There's no change in any particular event, and you're going to continue those same stereotypes and further be enforced because it's now brought to light again and again and sensationalized. We think that that's something that's extremely bad. So we tell you that very simply, we would rather it reach a smaller audience, individuals who are willing to learn what is the actual causes of particular events, of particular historical stories, or anything to that extent. Things like Padmavati, the reason why it was portrayed so badly was that it was it was claiming mainstream ideologies in how the Muslim or Mughals were portrayed in the first place. We think that we win out on this if you completely understand the actual context behind this particular debate. Now, to deal with the final rehash from closing government, right? They told us that number one, better money equals, we would do whatever we want to get better profit in order to get better exposure. This is the exact point that we're telling you, right? You're willing to do whatever it takes in order to drive that force for you to generate as much funds as you need in order to get the name that you need. This in itself shows you that you are also willing, and following the global market pressure and all these things, which is my point later on, sit down, you're also willing to trade off lots of other things. For example, you're also willing to not show certain accurate events. You're not willing to show certain things that actually happen just to captivate a larger amount of audience. Who's going to portray the United States in an extremely bad light if the United States is the major contributor towards the funding of your particular movie? We think that that's extremely wrong. Before I go on, yes.
First, it is a principle debate. Put your investors out. If you don't have lies, then how would that work? And what is the incentive for these people to learn? But secondly, can you also engage and provide positive content towards the homogenization of culture, right? And the involvement of culture?
Sit down. I think this is something that goes on with side opposition, right? We agree to the fact that culture has to evolve. We completely agree. Culture has always evolved. The problem is, you do not need to completely force a culture into the mainstream just so that people will know that that culture particularly exists without understanding the culture as a whole, right? We think that's completely nonsensical. If a culture chooses in the next 50, 20 years to evolve into adapting other strategies, we think it's fine. But we don't think forcing or showing these young filmmakers that your only opportunity to fame is by, degrading this particular culture or selling out your particular culture is the way to go. Sit down. Now, let's talk to you about the very simple point I have, right? The global market pressure and how the submissiveness of a culture is something that we will completely lose out, right? The problem is, ladies and gentlemen, if the problem is understanding of a culture, ladies and gentlemen, we ask you then simply, in which case do you get it? Do you get it when you have the same stereotypes, the same actors coming in again and again, portraying the same accents over and over, comparatively to an incentive where you have to read in order to understand a particular movie? We tell you in terms of understanding, ladies and gentlemen, it's much better on our side because you get a form of understanding as to what the culture wants to portray. Sit down. What the culture wants to portray, as well as verify the kind of nuances that happen in movies. Another problem with having the local filmmaker develop this particular kind of movie is that you have these individuals who are outside, these fence-sitters, who will use the local filmmaker as an authentication of these stereotypes that exist, because what they're going to say is that, look, ladies and gentlemen, your own filmmaker has portrayed your country like this. That means that your society has to be formed like this, and this creates more stereotypes. In the end, ladies and gentlemen, we'll tell you this, that stereotypes are created not because of an intrinsic culture, it's created because of people's perceptions. When you form or when you comply with the mainstream perceptions, ladies and gentlemen, you will only form more stereotypes. Therefore, we would prefer a quality audience that would understand the actual nuances and the actual history behind any form of text before they go on and besmirch the name of a culture for profit alone. Thank you.
Are you speaking for a speech? Some of the government side and other form of government.
I ran to
Please.
four actually.
Four actually, yeah. I find it funny that side government is wanting the profits and exposure, but not willing to acknowledge the fact that you would have to sell out your particular culture to a certain extent in order to achieve these goals. We told you specifically, yeah, fine, America, that whole America analogy was very simple, right? But if you do not subscribe to the largest quantity of individuals, then you lose out on these profits anyway. This means to say that if you are a local artist and you want to engage with the mainstream media, you have to incorporate the values of the mainstream media. You have to accept the stereotypes that exist. You have to accept the understanding of multiple individuals and their stereotypes and incorporate that into your movie in order for you to gain that kind of exposure, in order for you to gain that kind of profit and the traction that you are talking about. Now, our side opposition was very simple in this debate. We told you very simply that the watering down of our culture is not something we stand for and it's not something that's ethical to do. The simple reason, sit down, the simple reason we brought up was the fact that if a local filmmaker were to conform to mainstream media and all these of its ideas, it would be a sense, and this is something that came out from member speeches now, is that it would be a sense of authentication as to all these stereotypes that exist in a particular community or in a particular area or residence or particular skin color of individuals, right? This means that you have fence-sitters who sit down, who are not of the well-educated and not of the complete intellectuals that stand there and indulge in this movie and only understand the superficial values that are placed from the movie. Now, we told you specifically, and this is where we clash, right? We told you specifically that, look, the fact that if our movie is of a local value, of a local language, and of a local concept and theme, means that individuals who want to understand the movie have to pick up a book, or they have to do some form of research in order to understand the values behind this particular movie, or this particular text, or poem, or any form of literature, right? The bad side, on-site government, is that you are not forced to do this. You can buy the movie at face value, claim that it was a local filmmaker who made this movie, therefore the values must be true, or to a certain extent have to be true. This is the general population as a whole, and this is exactly what closing up argued to you. But the next thing, sit down. The next thing they came up and told us is that somehow the larger exposure any film has, the greater the understanding that individuals have. We don't think that's completely true, right? Because even after movies like 12 Years a Slave and all these things, we still had protests in Charlottesville when we wanted to remove statues of slavery masters and things like this, right? This means, ladies and gentlemen, that your entire case on how just because a movie gets wide exposure and wide reviews does not exactly lead to the understanding of individuals on the ground. We told you very simply that understanding only comes, ladies and gentlemen, when you are willing to understand and willing to open up and take the effort to understand what is going on in the first place. Sit down. But the next thing they told us is this, that evolutions of cultures must and has to take place. We think that this is completely false, right? We see this in Malaysia as well, where we have the Sarawakians and the Borneans, who are of the Iban tribes and all these things. We do not have to force them upon understanding taking into mainstream ideas and ideologies in order for them to survive. We think that is extremely false, and Mektap told you, I'll give credit to Mektap for this, in his initiative, that is very to force this idea that this is the only way for you to integrate yourself into society, and we are not willing to look any other way for you to integrate yourself. We think this is extremely derogatory, and we think this is extremely bad. But before 6, yes.
Yeah, if films alter the language and only the language and not your culture, because there was a stance that came up from opening government, and the engagement of culture happens, then how does homogenization of mainstream culture happens? We see Sanskrit ended, and we have new Indian philosophy.
Correct.
Based on your web
Sit down.
Sit
down. Just because you're Indian and you bring up Sanskrit does not mean that the actual values of certain languages are also lost when it's when it's translated, right? This is the same when we see like verses of the Quran that are translated, where values are lost or certain messages, important messages, cannot be translated. For example, the Chinese dialect has certain words or certain phrases that you can't directly translate into English to make another person understand. Therefore, what you are forced to do then is to either, number one, check out someone else or ask someone for guidance on this topic, or secondly, you're forced to do your own research as a whole. We think that this is the exact point that we want, right? Because then you produce more quality individuals who are more well-informed, who can fight the exact stereotypes that you come and pull out on us, because they are better informed and they're more educated. That's the end goal of side opposition. But the final argument, and this was the only contribution from closing government, sit down, this was the only contribution, is how they form a form of they give a form of discourse towards current societies and how ideas would come up and they would discuss it. We tell you this is completely false, right? Because number one, if the kind of discussions you're going to be having is mostly people reinforcing what they've seen or the stereotypes that they've seen and authenticating it based on like local filmmakers and things like that, then the discussion you're going to have is going to revolve around the same bubble of ideologies that people are going to. Why? This is because these individuals are going to believe what the movie says and going to only use this kind of movies as a form of justification as to what they've seen or what they've heard. But the next thing is this, that the actual meaning of the text will still be lost. Why? Because individuals who have this kind of discourse are most likely going to trust their own instincts and going to only stick on to their points and their guns. Their main idea, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that discourse is not going to exactly happen on their side. The form of discourse we have on our side is very simple, right? We tell you that it might be few in number, but individuals who have that kind of discourse would start to talk about more intellectual values or more understandable values towards that particular community. That means these are individuals who perhaps to a certain extent understand the Quran and have talks about terrorism or jihadism. These are individuals who have understanding on things like the Bible and talk about the things like crusades or talk about things like, you know, heaven and the concept of heaven and hell, and, you know, Indians with Sanskrit and rebirth. We'd rather, ladies and gentlemen, more intellectual and more understanding discussions happen comparatively to the trashing of a culture by reinforcing its stereotypes and bringing it back to light repeatedly. We tell you very simply, ladies and gentlemen, that side opposition is very proud to oppose here.
Thank you, speakers, for the debate. Please cross the washing hands and go outside. Oh, he was there, the kid there.
We have to leave them. They're going to make us keep them out. Yeah, I want to shake your hands outside.